Welcome to H2K Infosys. H2K Infosys is a e-verify business based in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. We provide 100% job-oriented, instructor-led, face-to-face, true live online software training programs. It also includes access to cloud test lab with software tools. We provide live project for you to work on. We also provide assistance with mock interviews, resume preparation and review, and job placement assistance. H2K Infosys is trusted by so many students across the world. H2K Infosys provides world-class services in IT training with real-time project work for corporates and individuals, special IT training for MS students in the United States, software design, development, QA manual and automation, performance testing and maintenance, IT staff augmentation, job placement assistance, and tech support.
Hi, Benny. Hi, Venkat. How are you? So, folks, everyone, I'll be giving you an assignment, a small program. End of the class, if I forget, please remind me. Okay? Okay. In the previous class, we were discussing about the exception hierarchy. What is the difference between an exception and error, and different kind of exceptions, the checked exceptions and the runtime exceptions, right? Just to revisit, errors and exceptions both are problems that are arise during the program execution. So what is the difference between an exception and an error? The common thing is they both extend from the superclass throwable, and error is something it is out of the programmer's control and it cannot be handled. Exception is thrown. The cause for the exception is the programmer's code, and exception can be handled. In exception, we have two types of exceptions: checked exceptions and the runtime exceptions. What is the checked exception? A checked exception is something wherein the compiler finds the exception and the compiler forces us to handle it or declare it. What is meant by handling it? Using the try-catch block. We handle exceptions using the try-catch block. What do I mean by declaring exception? Using the keyword throws. That is what is declaring exceptions. We're going to discuss it today. And the runtime exceptions are those exceptions, the compiler cannot identify them during the compile time. We're not aware of them during the compile time. But we get that exception when we run the program. When we run the program or when we execute the program, that is when we get the runtime exception. Null pointer exception, array index out of bound exception, all these exceptions are runtime exceptions. We don't identify them or we cannot see them during the compilation of the program. But when we run the code, we get those exceptions. And then there are some methods which are available in the throwable class, which gives the the detailed message on about the exception and what is the cause of that exception. We have different elements to get the stack trace where exactly that exception has propagated through. What is the origin of the exception? And handling exceptions. We use try catch block to handle exceptions. A try block can go with either catch block or finally. A try block cannot stand on its own. A try block should be followed by either catch block or finally. So we can have multiple catch blocks wherein we can catch different kind of exceptions, and the order of the catch blocks should be in such a way that the subclasses come first and then the superclasses. So if we keep a catch block for exception class, java.lang.exception, it catches all the exceptions. Because when we keep a catch block for a specific exception, it catches the same exception and it catches any of its subclasses. So all exceptions in Java are the subclasses of java.lang.exception. So the catch block for exception class will catch all the exceptions in Java. And then we have the finally block. The finally block gets executed all the time. Even if an exception is thrown or not, caught or not, the finally block gets executed. So whenever we open some resources like databases, files, we write code to close those resources in the finally block because we don't want to log them unnecessarily. So the only scenario when a finally block doesn't get executed is system.exit. When we say system.exit, the process itself gets killed and there is nothing that gets executed after system.exit.
So you said like in the finally block, usually the close statement of the file or database will be present, right?
Yes.
So if you are reading the file and processing, in that case, for each record, will it do that?
I'm sorry, I didn't get you. Could you repeat the last sentence?
So if you are doing a file processing,
okay.
So every time when it comes to this try block, and it will execute the finally block.
See, why will the try block get executed multiple times? You keep the opening and processing the file in the try block.
Right? So some validation we are keeping in a try block, and we are trying to handle the exception for that, where it needs to be executed for each and every record, right? Or no, not like that.
No, we don't do that. We don't do that. We should not write code in such a way. If you have some loop that happens like reading every file and processing it, that should go inside the try block, and there should be one finally block which should be handling it actually. That's the way we have to write the code. We should not give like try block and finally block in a loop. We should not do that. That's like opening and closing it unnecessarily, right?
Yeah, that's my question.
Yes, we don't do that. In a try block, let's say the first line of the try block, let's say we are opening the file, and the rest of the code will be like processing the file.
Yes.
You keep loop or whatever you have inside it, but you don't keep try catch finally in a loop. We don't do that.
Oh, okay.
You understand the point, right?
Yeah, that's what.
See, there is nothing that stops you from writing that code, but it is not appropriate to write the code code that way.
Right? Yeah. No need to close for every record.
Yeah, I have one question. Now, if I have some variable which has been defined before the try-catch block, and if I change its value in the try-catch block, if a exception is caught, what will be the value? Will it be the changed value, or
No,
will
see,
it?
if it is already changed, the value will be changed, right?
Okay.
So for example, I have int I is equal to 10 before try block. If I make I is equal to 20 in the try block, and after that line exception throws, I will be 20.
Okay.
But if you keep that specific line after exception is thrown, the code doesn't get executed, right?
Right.
Okay. Regarding the loop, what you just talked about. Okay, the try and catch block can be inside a loop or shouldn't be inside a loop.
Shouldn't be inside a loop. It depends on the scenario. For example, if you're opening it and reconnecting it to a database and all that, we shouldn't be. For example, let's say I want to insert 10 records in the database.
Okay, that opens many connections you're saying.
Ideally, what we should be doing, we open the connection once, we insert 10 records, and then we should be closing the connection, right?
I get it. But there can be a loop inside a try and catch block, right?
There can be a loop inside a try and catch block. It's not like we cannot make a headline saying that we cannot write a loop in a try block. No, we cannot say that. But in that specific scenario, what Venkat has asked, we shouldn't be like, opening the connection, close it. Open the connection, insert first record, close it. Open connection again, insert second, close it. We shouldn't be doing that way. Instead, we open the connection, insert all the records, and then we have it in the final block. If something happens in that iteration of inserting the records, it comes and closes it. But it's not that you do it every time. I mean, for every insertion in this specific example, we shouldn't be doing it.
Even if there is a loop inside a try block, doesn't it generate multiple exception objects or something like that?
See, there is no generation of the multiple exceptions. Whenever an exception is thrown, the code after that doesn't get executed. Whatever the code that is present in the try block, after an exception is thrown, that doesn't get executed.
Oh, okay. The loop breaks. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Okay, folks. I mean, we were saying declaring exceptions. So what do I mean by declaring exception? When you have some exception in a specific class, in a specific method, if an exception is getting thrown, so what do? If it is, we can handle it or we can declare it. When I say we are declaring it, we are not handling the exception there. For example, I just keep here. I say, let's say I have a method, okay? I'm creating a method. Let's say it throws exception. So this method is throwing exception. So for example, I have some code inside this method. Let's say I'm saying thread.sleep. This sleep method throws an interrupted exception, which is a compile time exception, right? So we have to handle it or declare it. So folks, if I double click on this, it gives me two options. One is surround with try catch block, which we already did, and what we call it as the handling of exceptions. And another is add throws declaration. When I do this, we call this as declaring exception. So we are not handling exception, but we are declaring that this method is throwing exception. We are saying this method throws exception. So it is not handled inside this method, but whoever calls this method, the code wherein we call this method, we have to handle it over there. For example, I call this method. Let's say, for example, I just make it a static. So I can easily call it. For example, from here, can I call this method from here? The method which I have created, the throws exception. Yes, because it is a static method. We don't need to create an object to call a static method, right? So we can call it. We can call it here. So what it gives in compilation error saying unhandled exception. So when we declare exception at a certain point, what are we doing it? We are not handling it, but they are saying whoever calls this code or whoever uses this code, they have the buck of handling that exception. So instead of handling it there, whoever uses the code, whoever calls the method has to handle it. We use the keyword throws to specify or that a method is throwing exception. To declare exception, we use the keyword throws. When we say throws, which means that this method might throw an interrupted exception. This method is throwing it might throw an exception of type interrupted exception. So here I can say if a method is throwing multiple exceptions, I can specify it as comma separated. Different kind of exceptions. I can specify different kind of exceptions like this. So this method, for example, is throwing alpha exception. It might throw interrupted exception also. It might throw some other exception also. You can give it a comma separated. So this is about declaring exceptions. We use the keyword throws to declare exceptions. So there is one more keyword for us, throw. What is throw? Throw is we throw exceptions in our code. We use the keyword throw to throw exceptions in our code. For example, there is some validation that we make to validate some input push, for example. We have some state, so we want to validate it. When we validate it, we throw our own exceptions. We create user-defined exceptions and then we throw it. So if you want to throw an exception, everything is an object in Java. Even exception is an object. If you want to throw an exception, we have to create an exception object. So using the new operator, we create an exception object and we say throw exception. This is the syntax of throwing exception. Here the developer from the code, we are throwing exception explicitly. We are throwing exception on this. Therein when we use the keyword throw.
What is the meaning of throwing an exception? Are we asking the code to exit at this point?
See, if you're not handling it, that's the flow that determines it. So whoever calls this method, if they have some functionality of handling it, right? So they put a try block, and inside it, if this exception is thrown, they'll have some specific functionality that they want to do when this exception is thrown. So that particular piece of code, they put it in the catch block, right?
Yeah. So no, I'm a bit confused. Can you say?
No. What are you getting confused at? Where are you getting confused?
That catch, try, catch, and throws is fine. So means I was thinking where can we what is the use of throw? So if I write throw new remote exception, so will the code get terminated after that, or why do we want to do this?
See, we throw a specific kind of exception, and we will be handling that exception somewhere. Usually we'll be throwing the exception explicitly. There are two kind of scenarios wherein we do it. First scenario is when we have different layers. For example, usually when we go to a web application, right? So any application. So here in the front end, you have the user interface, right? Folks, follow very carefully. UI layer. Whenever user comes, he wants to log in, we want to validate against the database. And whenever user enters some data, right, we want to put it in the database, right? There is certain kind of interaction that happens from the UI to the database. Folks, do you agree on that?
Yes.
Yes. So does the UI go and directly talk to the database? And hears back from the database directly? No. There will be different layers here. At least, like the first layer at least will be like the actions. Like depending on the framework, there are some kind of a Java beans, or to say at a high level, there will be some kind of, let's say, actions or controllers. In a very simpler way, we can just, we can even say them as Java beans. There are some kind of a Java classes that directly interacts with the UI. So they are called as beans or actions or controllers depending on the framework. For example, if you are using threads, we call them as actions. And if you are using Spring, we call them as controllers. And then here we have a service layer. And after the service layer, we have the Vivo layer. Sorry folks, my paint is really bad, but if you understand it, that's worth making it. So we have the business object layer. And here we have the DAO layer, data object. So what happens? The DAO layer is the one. When we say layer, what do I mean? They are nothing but classes at different levels. There is nothing a kind of physical layer that presents. There are different classes. So from UI, we direct, when I do a specific action on the screen, it calls like say something like that in the controller. For example, we are doing a login. So what happens? It passes those details to the service layer. And those, in turn, it goes to the Vivo layer. And then it's like the data access object, which interacts with the database, which happens to and fro between the database and the DAO. Right? For example, when we're checking when a person logs in, we want to verify if a person is already, if a username and password exists. So we first, with the data, we try to get the data, right? Or when the user is first signing up, we want to insert in the database, right? And then whatever it happens, the control, like, it again goes back to the UI, right? So what exactly is the exception handling that we do is, for example, I'm not able to connect to the database, or I'm not able to get some data. I have an exception in the DAO layer. So in the DAO layer, if an exception is thrown, so in the Vivo layer, what we do, we catch that exception. I mean, in the DAO layer, it catches the data access exception and it throws a Vivo exception. In the Vivo layer, we catch the Vivo exception and we throw a service exception. And same, it goes on till actions or controllers. But in actions or controllers, we don't rethrow it again. What do? We want to give a specific meaningful message to the user. So there will be some object which contains the messages that we want to display to the user. So finally, when we catch the service exception in action or controller layer, or the Java beans which directly connects to the UI, we add that to the messages object. It can be different for different frameworks, but we add that to the messages and we push it back to the UI. So why are we doing it? Like, in Vivo layer, we catch Vivo exception and we throw service exception. So then we are throwing the exception explicitly, right?
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yes, this is one scenario. Even the same case, if I want to do some validations, right? So let's say I don't want a username to contain some characters. So I want to do a validation. When it comes to the action or controller layer itself, I just make a validation and say, if I want to check for a field, let's say, for only alphabet or alphanumeric. So I create my own exception, let's say, alphanumeric exception. And if that string contains anything other than a character and, other than an alphabet and a number, I throw that exception, right? So on that exception, what do we add to the message? We try to add, we get the message from it and we add it to the message, right? So if we define an exception in that, for that exception class, I say get message, I define my own message. saying, this field can only be alphanumeric. You understand? So when I throw that exception, in the exception object get message, we have this information, right?
Yeah. So basically, we throw an exception when means there is already an exception, and we kind of partially handle it or like do something.
You want to throwing it to a different level, you throw a different exception. Or you are doing some validations, in that scenario, we throw an exception.
Okay.
So for example, let's see, we want to create user-defined exceptions, right? So how do we define user-defined exceptions? We have to extend the exception class. So I'm creating an exception, say number exception. Let's say I'm just taking an example. Let's say I'm creating a new class. Okay. So usually when we're creating exception, someone is asking something.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Rahul. So the exception object actually carries the information, whatever message that has been passed through to the UI, to the user, right?
Yes, not only the message, where is it caused, the exception object has that information.
Yeah. Okay, all the description of the exception is passed through the exception object.
So many of our students have given testimonials on how our training programs are. You will find them on kudzu.com and on our website h2kinfosys.com. On our website h2kinfosys.com, you will also find more detailed information on who we are, the courses that we offer, what each course covers. Also, if you're interested in a demo program, please register on our homepage on the left-hand side. Just give us more information about yourself and we will send you a link for a demo class. The demo class is absolutely free. Experience our commitment by just attending an orientation workshop at no cost. Our team of faculty and advisors are here to guide you with the right information. If you still have more questions, please feel free to call us. Call us at 770-777-1269. This is a United States number. If you're calling from the UK, call us at 020-337-17615. You can also email us at training@h2kinfosys.com or h2kinfosys@gmail.com. Thank you for watching our videos. We wish you a great career in information technology.